Hello and welcome to This Week in Global Development. My name is David Ainsworth. I'm the business editor here at Devex, and I'm joined this week on the podcast by my boss, group editor Alan Gawel, and by her boss, editor-in-chief Kumar. So I don't know whether I'm brave or foolish to be interviewing my boss and my boss's boss, but here we are anyway. And this week we're going to continue really to cover the kind of story of the kind of dismantling of US aid. We really kind of entered a new phase of the kind of series of events where we're really focusing on the lawsuits. Now, this is kind of late last week. I think we began to see a sort of fight back begin among people who potentially lost their job or people who were potentially losing funding. And we saw a series of lawsuits filed challenging the action so far of the administrators of USAID, the State Department, Doge, kind of pushing back against all of this. So, Anna, I understand this morning you and last night you spent a while kind of combing through all these lawsuits, trying to work out all the important ones that are happening and where we are with them all. Could you kind of break down to us what you think are the 2 or 3 kind of key lawsuits that are happening just now?
Sure. So there's 4 that we're closely tracking. There are sure to be more in the near future. But one of the biggest ones involves a lawsuit brought by implementing partners, specifically for-profit contractors and NGOs, who won a pretty significant victory last week when the judge ruled that the Trump administration had to lift its blanket freeze on foreign aid for existing programs. And that raised the hopes of hundreds of organizations that the money would start flowing again. Yesterday, the government countered that while the blanket freeze was ordered to be lifted, the judge's ruling also said that normal contract clauses could be enforced. Based on that argument, it says it has terminated some 500 USAID contracts, grants, awards, and so forth that it says is according to the terms and conditions of the contracts and that are inconsistent with U.S. national interests. So this has disqualified a number of programs that focus, for instance, on DEI, climate change, kind of general waste. And then one important point on the general waste, the government is also undertaking a review of agreements for potential waste, abuse, and fraud. This is a line-by-line review, so it's going to take a lot of time. And some have speculated that the government is kind of using this review as a smokescreen to drag the process out and basically not pay its bills despite the court order. And then one more thing, it's important to remember that this is all happening against the backdrop of the ongoing waiver application process, which many organizations that we've spoken to say is completely chaotic, and that even when a waiver is granted, the payment system is down. And so, again, this kind of goes back to the overarching point that the money is not flowing, and the odds are it will not start flowing for most organizations anytime soon, if ever. Really?
Okay. Yeah. And this is connected to this idea that most of these organizations are owed several months of pay already for work that they've already done. They're not getting paid for that. The government is not issuing any new grants and contracts, so nobody's getting any money for that. And people are quite confused about whether they should carry on working or stop working on some of the things that they're currently doing. Raj, you connected up earlier this week with Rob Nichols, who's one of the lawyers who's kind of closely involved in leading all these lawsuits. He wasn't, I think, totally optimistic about the chances for success. What were the kind of key things that you took away from your conversation with him?
Yeah, so everybody in this town is focused on kind of now the next phases, right? The first phase was understanding what does the Trump administration want to do? Who are these people? Who is Pete Morocco? Who are some of the characters involved? And what are their interests? Doge, et cetera. Now everyone has shifted to 2 new venues, the courts and the Congress. And that's where the attention is going. And in both cases, it seems like, and Rob Nichols really laid this out, I thought, very clearly in our pro briefing, that there's kind of 2 paths. There's the constitutional path and there's the contracts law path. Like the constitutional path is courts saying, and people going to the courts and saying, does the government even have the right to do this? Yeah, do they have rights here? Because I thought the Congress has allocated this money, appropriated this money, and authorized it, and therefore doesn't the government just have to go and implement based on what the Congress told it to do? So there's a really important constitutional question. It's dealing with this Impoundment Act that came about during the Nixon administration, which essentially says that the government has to do what the Congress says. The Congress has the power of the purse, according to our Constitution. The Trump administration has made it really clear they don't agree with that, and they want to take back some of that power. So there's a constitutional path where you're having lawsuits that could ultimately get to the Supreme Court. That will take time, and we don't know what the resolution there will be. The other path is the contracts law path, where people say, hey, look, I've got a contract, and it has specific terms in it, and you got to honor it. And that's where you see a lot of activity. I think a lot of contractors, grantees were pretty timid in the beginning. They're starting to realize like this is existential. They may go out of business. So they're more likely now to sue, and you're seeing many more lawsuits. He explained you're seeing lawsuits that are the people who hold the contract with the government, but then even like their subcontractors suing them. And you can see more and more of that too. So this will be like a jobs program for lawyers if we're not careful. But at the end of the day, the government has a lot of tools. And one of the most important tools is to just slow everything down. And that seems to be what's going on, right? Maybe you get a waiver somehow. Marco Rubio gave you a waiver, but then somebody else doesn't actually release the funding. Maybe they say, okay, we're going to release the funding, but then it turns out the software doesn't work. And this Phoenix system is held up. Maybe somebody in Doge at the Treasury isn't going to authorize that payment ultimately. So there are so many hurdles that have been set up to try to avoid the government paying out, that essentially the facts on the ground are starting to change, which is organizations who did work prior to January 19th, prior to the inauguration, haven't been paid for it. And yeah, they can wait a little while, but most of these organizations do not have a big endowment. They're not sitting on a lot of cash. So they have to start furloughing people, firing people, shutting down offices, et cetera. And the longer this goes on, the worse those cuts have to be. And then on top of it, what you said, Dave, becomes more and more important, that there's no new business. So we're just being paid for what used to happen. If there's nothing new, they could be really sunk. So it seems as though part of the strategy here is to essentially decimate the ecosystem around USAID, such that even if we get to that second menu, Congress, and even if Congress decides to push back and decides to, in their next budget, say, no, we're going to appropriate money, we're going to stand up and say, we need to have that money spent. Even if all that happens, it's not clear who will be there to do the work. And Rob described in the conversation that maybe part of their goal is to have a whole new set of implementing partners, different contractors, people that they think are more aligned to their worldview and to their political leanings. And so it's a pretty fundamental shift happening, and it's across these new venues. Congress is maybe less active now than the courts, but it's soon going to become the place people are really focused.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Let's pick up a couple of details on this. So first of all, I think people put a lot of hope on this temporary restraining order that they would get paid as a result of it. That doesn't look that likely at the moment, as I understand it. It looks like the government is pushing back on that, saying, well, sure, in theory, but we're not actually going to do it in practice. Is that where we are?
I think so. Yeah. I mean, Anna, you tell me what you think, but Rob was describing how there's the bottom of page 14 and the top of page 15 of that ruling, and they sort of contradict each other, and there's some gray area, and the government, I think, is driving a truck right through that lane that was laid for them in the TRO and temporary restraining order, which says, hey, we got contracts. The contracts have suspension provisions. We have the right to terminate. We're going to just follow that. And he was also explaining for cooperative agreements and grants, there's even fewer rights for the holders of those, which are mostly nonprofit organizations. So they have even fewer rights to go back and fight for their payments. And so the government has a lot of tools here, and they're using them.
Yeah, no, exactly. And, even again, if it's these review processes, so it's not just the waiver application review process, it's now review of all the agreements. And so far you've seen also State Department agreements terminated specifically because, there was that gray area of, that you can enforce existing clauses. And like Raj mentioned, in grants, cooperative agreements, you have even less protection. So, yeah, I mean, and I think even if there was actually an emergency motion filed right after the government presented this argument, late last night. And I love how this always come very late at night. The newsroom just loves that. But so you've already kind of got the tit for tat going there. But again, as long as the government's undergoing this review, as long as it controls the payment system, again, it comes back to the money. It's just not flowing.
Yeah. So I think maybe we could get a little bit too far into the details here. There are a number of technicalities, which, given that none of us are lawyers,
if you want to get into the weeds, you watch the pro briefing with Rob Nichols. I mean, that's the place to go. And he gets into a lot of the details. And we answered a lot of questions. We have hundreds and hundreds of people join that. So a lot of interesting questions and comments worth checking out.
Yeah, and Rob was excellent. I thought really, really clear. So, but let's just turn our attention to another lawsuit for a minute here, Anna, because they seem to be multiplied. There's another one, as I understand it, targeting brought by employees of USAID about whether they actually get to keep their jobs or not. Where are we with that?
So yeah, that's another big one, and it deals specifically with USAID direct hires. And the last temporary restraining order ordered that thousands of them could not be placed on administrative leave. It also kind of ordered a reprieve for direct hires who are posted overseas, that they wouldn't necessarily need to be recalled within 30 days. So now we've had a new twist on that as well. There was a follow-up hearing yesterday. The judge said that conflicting statements about that recall for overseas people posted overseas had created a quote-unquote mess. And I mean, I think a lot of people who are in this situation would agree that it is a mess. You know, we've heard, I think what was really interesting and striking in this hearing and just the court documents in general are kind of these personal stories and experiences that the employees are alleging. You know, you have, we've written about a pregnant woman who said the stress of the situation caused life-threatening complications. There are a lot of stories about a very harrowing evacuation from the Democratic Republic of Congo. There's also really a lot of stories in terms of just not being repaid tens of thousands of dollars for what people say are reimbursable travel costs. So that lawsuit is ongoing. There is another one where private service contractors have become involved, where they were some of the first to fully lose their job. It's not even about administrative leave. And they are also pushing to get their jobs back, basically. And there is another one against Elon Musk and the Department of Government Efficiency that's been brought by a group of USAID employees. And that's more of a broader lawsuit that's filed differently, a bit differently in Maryland. But the parallel there, again, is these personal stories of people. You know, Doge has posted some personal details of a lot of the people who were terminated or put on administrative leave. And that has worried quite a few people in terms of, you know, is it possible retribution? My information is personally online. So I think these lawsuits, the stories are coming out of the woodwork, and they're adding this kind of firsthand tangible impact of what this freeze and the repercussions that it's had. But so far, there hasn't been much resolution. Again, it's almost day by day that the government and the plaintiffs are expected to come up with their different arguments. But so it's a day by day process. The temporary restraining orders, so they end, like one will end on Friday and so forth. They're looking for longer injunctions. But long story short, no resolution anytime soon.
Yeah, a high percentage of the people who work at USAID are on these kinds of contracts, these professional services contracts, or they're there through these institutional support contracts. And that's just the way business is done. It's the way Congress has essentially set up USAID. And a lot of these folks, they've been doing it for years, and they have this technically a contract status. They might feel like they really work at USAID, but they're technically a contractor. And so as Doge went in and said, hey, let's cut contracts, to meet our objectives, saving funds, et cetera, they have this website set up and they're listing contracts they've terminated. And suddenly you might find yourself that you personally are on that list because you're technically a contract holder, and it's your home address and your cell phone number, right? I mean, it's I've gone through this list myself, but it's just kind of crazy. And my guess is, as these people, were working at USAID for years, they never expected, when they filled out some form, that their personal information like that would appear on a site like this, and certainly one that's so highly politicized, right? So, that's just one little vignette. And then, of course, we're hearing all these stories of people. You referred to some of them, Anna, but like real personal hardship for people who are serving in a job for the government. Like this is not something they asked for or expected. And suddenly they find themselves stuck overseas, stuck with bills, stuck dealing with their kids in school and trying to sort out their lives. I mean, it's hard to overstate just how destabilizing this has been for a lot of American families posted all over the world who just thought they were doing a good thing working for their government, and here they are.
Yeah, let's talk a little bit about the impact, actually, because there's a number of impacts here. The impact on USAID employees has obviously been incredible. And then the impact on their partners has been massive as well. We're hearing that there's maybe tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of jobs lost in INGOs and their partners. And then we're only, I think, just beginning to understand the actual development impact, the potential lives lost because we're not providing essential food or providing essential healthcare. Do we think we've got a good kind of handle on that yet?
I don't, there are some organizations, and we've talked about this, Dave, like PEPFAR, the HIV/AIDS initiative, that have been putting out some estimates of how many people are being deprived of antiretroviral treatments. But it's really difficult because this is such an unfolding process. We had this in our edition of Dish this week, where talking about malnutrition, where some programs received a waiver, some didn't. It was for acute child malnutrition, I believe. And so there's so many of these different layers, and you can't instantly tell, well, because this one program was discontinued, that means X number of lives are affected, or, possibly it's life-threatening. But, you just look at like the breadth of USAID. It's a roughly $40 billion annual budget, footprint of over, I believe, 130 countries. And people don't realize like the intricacies of what it provides. You've got obviously HIV meds, malnutrition treatments, but also even things like firewood for Ukrainian soldiers on the front line. So it's really difficult to gauge, the number of lives impacted. But certainly it's a huge number. And I think it's something, I'm glad you pointed that out, because we are consistently talking about the lawsuits and the implementing partners and the employees, which certainly have had, very adverse consequences because of this. But certainly we are talking about, I think it's safe to say you're talking about hundreds of thousands, if not millions of lives that will at least be fundamentally altered over the months ahead.
$40 billion, or, it's actually bigger when you look at some of the humanitarian aid that's been spent. It gets up to close to $70 billion. It's in a way a rounding error in the United States, right? It's 1% of the US federal budget, but in the countries we're talking about, in many cases, this is like a real material part of their gross national product. Like this is a big part of their economy for low-income countries. So I think it's going to take a while before we still see the full reverberation effects. Some, as Anna said, are really obvious because it's about direct service provision. But a lot of what USAID is doing is not about direct service provision. It's about technical support and advice. And like, for example, they were supporting the cybersecurity department in the Ukrainian government. So now, their cybersecurity defenses are going to go down. But how quickly does that happen? When do you see an impact? It's hard to know. So measuring it is tricky. One of the new factors that I learned when I was at the Munich Security Conference this past weekend was that, and talking to some aid ministers from other countries, is the fact that a lot of the implementing partners for USAID program work, they also do work for other aid ministries. And as a result, as they get weaker, those implementing partners, let's say they lose 40% of their budget because of what's happened at USAID, suddenly they have to lay off a lot of people. Some of those are the same people who were working on programs funded by other donors. And so actually there's a need to really assess, what are the impacts for even donors who are not directly affected by USAID? It turns out their work is, their partners are. And so you could see even more of a second and third stage ripple effect. And a lot of organizations, I learned, are out there doing this now. They're like carefully trying to map out what is their exposure, because you're going to see organizations maybe just go out of business. They can't afford, some of their core functions that was paid through USAID, but support other donor work as well. So there's a lot of implications. I will just mention, we just got this morning the latest US labor statistics. And they don't show yet in DC or in the DMV area, the Delaware, Maryland, Virginia area. You don't actually see any effects yet. And my guess is maybe it'll be the next labor report, because I think you're going to be seeing tens of thousands of people ultimately. It should show up even at the national labor statistics level in the United States, because the numbers are big enough, not just from USAID, but from some of the other federal government agencies that have been affected too.
Yeah, and there have been steady cuts as well. And there was a report that they will be looking at Defense Department for potential cuts. And that's a huge workforce, I think like 900,000 civilian workers. So eventually these numbers, I think, I agree with Raj, will show up.
Yeah, I mean, I was looking at the UN OCHA figures this morning, the Office of Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs. 300 million people in need of urgent humanitarian support, and 40% plus of that budget comes from USAID. So most of those people, I think, will be touched in some way or another by these cuts, all 300 million of them, because a very large number of them are receiving food or medicine or some other service from the United States.
And what's particularly tough about that, Dave, is that nobody in that system thinks it's perfect. And there's a lot of people who wanted to reform the humanitarian aid system, who thought USAID needed much deeper reform. And the problem is the speed of this. In theory, maybe you could cut the budget and still get more money out to people by funding local organizations or using technology and innovation. There are a lot of people who wanted to see this kind of new approach, but the fact that it's happening so fast means there's no time for that transition. And if you're one of those 300 million people who is relying on that ready-to-use therapeutic food to save your child's life, there is no time for some new model, some new approach to develop. You may have real life consequences because this system has been disrupted so fast.
Yeah, it seems inevitable that lives will be lost, and it's just a question of trying to understand the scale of how many lives, really. I wanted to talk briefly about you were at the Munich Security Conference just recently, Raj. You mentioned that. What were you hearing there? What was the talk there? To what extent was it dominated by US? Obviously, there were some real fireworks for the United States at that conference, not just in aid, but kind of a really inflammatory speech from JD Vance about kind of telling us Europeans we need to sort our act out. So which has gone down, I would say, like a bucket of cold sick here in the United Kingdom. So what was the chatter though? When you were talking to development professionals from all over the world and to leaders of governments who are directly affected, senior people within those administrations, what were you hearing?
I'm not sure I had a single conversation where the Trump administration didn't come up. It was completely dominated by what's happening in the United States, for good reason, of course. It was my first time at this conference. For people who aren't familiar, it is a major moment in the global calendar. And you're in this old European hotel. Everybody's just jammed in. It's not some modern conference center. It's a really old-fashioned place, which is charming. But there's several hundred of us just jammed in, and the people you're elbow to elbow with are often generals in their full uniforms, right? And admirals in the Navy. It's a lot of defense and security people. But increasingly, there's an intersection with their issues and with development and humanitarian issues. So the MSC has really tried to lean into that. They're doing a lot of work around food security, and they asked Devex to be a media partner this year. So we were thrilled to do that. And we hosted a session, and we had a lot of great discussions and interviews there. And the mood generally, Dave, was paralleled in the security space and in other areas with what people thought in development, which is we thought we used to have this global system where everybody worked together. There was a sense of cooperation. And now all of a sudden, the US is very much on its own path. And they don't seem to really care about what we're doing. Maybe they're going to criticize us, but they're kind of doing their own thing. And so we're left a little bit in the lurch to figure out, well, what do we do? What's our strategy? How do we respond? And so there was a lot of discussion in terms of figuring out what the response might be. I spoke with the president of the European Parliament about this issue, and she said, look, we're getting a lot of calls from people. Can we fill the gap from what USAID is doing? Maybe we can't really fill the gap entirely, but we're looking for where we can play a more positive and strategic role. People were trying to figure out, is this a blip? Is the US going to come back to international cooperation later? what exactly does it mean? So we're fielding lots of conversations and questions along those lines. And everything was dominated by this famous speech that JD Vance gave, which read a little bit differently in Germany than it might have in the UK or in the US, where in Germany, they have an election this Sunday, in a few days. And for the first time, they're likely to see 1 in 4, maybe 1 in 5 voters vote for a far-right party that a lot of the Germans I spoke with actually referred to as the Nazi Party of Germany. That's a controversial point, but a lot of people do. It's the AfD party. And, a lot of people in the room felt, German officials felt and even said publicly, they thought JD Vance was kind of putting his thumb on the scale of the election. Not speaking to the people in the room, but speaking to the Germans outside, and trying to encourage them to consider voting for this far-right party. And so that really destabilized the Germans. They were thinking, wow, we thought maybe the U.S. is going its own way, but now they're like actively undermining, our worldview. And so it's hard to overstate just how destabilizing this Munich Security Conference was. And military leaders I talked to, talking about having their own plan, doing their own thing, not even necessarily coordinating everything through NATO. Like, how do we find our own approach and our own strategy? Because that's how destabilized they feel. So it was really, I think, a real moment in history. People are going to look back on this. Who knows where it goes from here? But if the Trump administration continues in this line, it's a major shift. And Michael Wurst, who is the Munich Security Conference's senior advisor, he runs everything North America, all their multilateral relationships. He and I just did a pro briefing yesterday, and he talked about this like great schism happening between Europe and the U.S. that maybe is like the end of transatlantic ties. Which, if that's the case, wow, I mean that's a major thing, right? And it affects everything, including, of course, global cooperation on climate, on global health, on economic development, you name it.
Yeah, I have to say that's very much the mood here in the United Kingdom. A lot of people talking to me about this, saying we've lost a lot of trust. Trust takes a long time to build, and you can lose it very, very quickly. And of course, we are all scrambling as well, thinking, well, we've kind of been in a partnership with the United States. We've relied on the US for a lot of things. That looks quite unwise now. How are we going to sort this out? And I mean, rather randomly, I went down to the pub last night to watch a football match, took my dog. People started talking, like people started talking to the dog, let's be honest. But when they found out I was an international development journalist, they were onto this. Like, oh, what do you think of Trump? What do you think of this? Like everybody. Very hard to watch the football, if I'm perfectly honest, because everybody wanted to have a chat with me about kind of how this was going and what was going on, really dominating the kind of national discourse all over the world. So it will be very interesting to see how this goes. So I think final question, because we need to wrap this up shortly. Where do we see this going next? What do we think are the next steps in the kind of journey specifically for international development?
I think Congress is a big part of where we go. So far, Republicans in Congress have been pretty quiet. I mean, in private conversations behind closed doors, they have expressed dismay at what's going on because, of course, mostly USAID is earmarked, right? And these are programs they have wanted to fund, they have fought to fund, they believe in, and then to suddenly see that they're all called fraud and abuse and being unilaterally cut. For many, I won't say for all, but for many members of Congress, including Republicans, they're thinking, whoa, this is not what I wanted. So there's real concern. However, they seem very scared to say that publicly. They're worried, the president and Elon Musk have mentioned, we don't want to have to, but we will primary people. We will go after, we'll spend money on opponents to you within the Republican Party if we have to get out anybody who's not aligned with this approach. So people are scared. However, Jim Richardson, who was the head of the Office of Foreign Assistance at the State Department during the first Trump administration, told me in another pro briefing, look, Congress has a continuing resolution. It's going to expire soon. We're talking in a few weeks. The Congress has to come up with a new budget, a new continuing resolution, or pass a budget. It's going to be a strange moment, right? They have to say, wait, do we pass the budget at the level we did last time, but then the president just didn't spend it? Or do we go down to the level that the president wants to spend? Like, what is that? Is it $0? Like, what is it? And so there's a moment now in a few weeks and happening now for real advocacy, real lobbying, and maybe you end up with some kind of a clearer vision going forward. I mean, it seems likely it's a much diminished foreign assistance budget, but it might not be zero. It might not be, what it was, but it could be somewhere in the middle, and there might be some clarity to come out of it in terms of what is that amount and what is it going to be spent on. That does better align with both what the president wants to see, what the Republicans in Congress want to see, and maybe even what some Democrats can agree to. So I think that's where the venue shifts, right? The legal matters they're very important. There's a lot of people pouring their attention there, but very soon, and already in sort of quiet ways, the Congress is where the action is going to be.
Yeah, I think to Raj's point, also talking about Democrats, I mean, I cannot stress enough, they are in the minority. So far their power has been extremely limited outside of, protests and some resolutions. But come March 14th, which is the expiration of the current federal spending budget, they are going to have a lot more leverage. And it does depend how much are they willing to bring up U.S. aid. I think that some of the larger issues, like I said, if you've got Defense Department cuts, you're going to definitely have both Democrats and Republicans a bit upset, but quite upset about that. And so will the foreign aid freeze be lumped in together as part of this opposition, this more general opposition toward the government cuts, the budget cuts? That's a really important question. That's one I'm following, especially going into February and March. That's going to be really critical to see once Democrats kind of have more leverage, how will they use it?
And what aid advocates are starting to get around, Dave, is they're starting to, they're mostly shocked, depressed, knocked back. But what I'm starting to hear more of are people saying, we need our own proactive, positive vision. We can't just defend what was, because frankly, there were a lot of things wrong with the way things were set up before. So we need a new approach. What is that? What are we advocating for exactly? And they kind of need to come up with that, show the negative impacts of this disruption, of these kinds of cuts, and then come out with something new that maybe they can get a majority in Congress behind, that they can bring some conservatives along with, that might have more private sector orientation, that might have less overhead and bureaucracy, that might be more localized and more effective, maybe more directly counters China in some ways. So I think I'm starting to hear it. Many people are not there yet psychologically for good reason. They're mostly spending their days like laying off people. I mean, it's a very, very tough moment here. I can't really say enough how tough it is, but they're starting to get to this point of saying, hey, we got to come through this. We're going to need a new vision and something we can advocate for, not just going back to what was, because it's probably not going to happen.
Wow, seems like a note of optimism on which to leave this, which is certainly something I think we need at the moment. An optimistic view of where we might get to in the future. It's been slightly hard to have that in the last couple of weeks, but perhaps I think the development sector is by its nature extremely optimistic. So hopefully we can start to coalesce around that new vision and work towards something that's really positive. Well, thank you very much to both of you, to Anna and to Raj. That was a fascinating discussion. And thank you very much to all our listeners as well. And that was This Week in Global Development. We hope you find it very useful. Thank you.